The endless cycle. Why a US Iran conflict would keep starting and stopping. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Iran has existed in a strange state between war and peace. Unlike conventional conflicts that begin with a declaration and end with a treaty, the US Iran confrontation has repeatedly shifted between periods of intense hostility and uneasy calm. Missile strikes are followed by negotiations, economic sanctions are followed by diplomatic outreach, proxy attacks trigger retaliation, only for both sides to step back from the edge. This recurring pattern has led many analysts to ask whether the future holds a decisive resolution or merely another chapter in an endless cycle of escalation and de escalation. The recent tensions and ceasefire discussion have once again raised this question. Will the conflict finally end, or are we witnessing another temporary pause before the next crisis emerges? To understand the answer, it is necessary to look beyond individual battles and focus on strategic incentives driving both nations. The reality is that neither Washington nor Tehran appears eager for a full scale war, yet neither side is willing to surrender its core interests. This creates a dangerous middle ground where conflict becomes chronic rather than decisive. In many ways, the US Iran rivalry resembles a pressure cooker. Tension built for months or years until an incident pushes both sides towards confrontation. After a period of military exchanges and political brinkmanship, economic costs and strategic risks encourage restraint. The pressure is released temporarily, but the underlying disputes remain unresolved. As a result, the cycle begins again. Understanding why this happens is the key to understanding why future start conflicts may become more likely than either lasting peace or total war. The roots of the rivalry. The modern conflict between the United States and Iran didn't emerge overnight. Its origin stretches back to the 20th century and are deeply connected to power, ideology, competing visions for the Middle East. For much of the Cold War, Iran was one of Washington's most important regional partners. Under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Iran received American support, economic assistance, and political backing. The country was viewed as a strategic pillar protecting Western interests in the Persian Gulf. Everything changed in 1979. The Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah and replaced the monarchy with an Islamic republic led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. The new government defined itself as defined itself in opposition to American influence and portraying the United States as an external power that had interfered in Iranian affairs for decades. The seizure of US embassy in Tehran and the hostage crisis that followed transformed the relationship from alliance to hostility almost overnight. Over the decades that followed, mistrust hardened into a permanent feature of the relationship. Washington viewed Iran as a sponsor of militant groups across the Middle East and a potential nuclear threat. Tehran viewed the United States as a hostile superpower seeking regime change and regional dominance. Each side developed narratives that reinforced its own positions. Every confrontation, sanction, proxy conflict, or military incident became additional evidence supporting those narratives. What makes the rivalry especially difficult to resolve is that it is not based on a single dispute. It involves security concerns, ideological differences, regional influences, military alliances, energy routes, and nuclear technology. Even if one issue is temporarily addressed, several others remain. This complexity explains why diplomatic breakthroughs often fail to produce lasting peace. The conflict is not a single knot that can be unified. It is an entire network of competing interests stretching across the Middle East. Why neither side wants a full scale war. Despite decades of hostility and repeated military confrontations, both the United States and Iran have generally avoided crossing the threshold into a direct and prolonged war. The restraint is not driven by trust or goodwill, it is driven by strategic calculation. The costs of a full scale conflict are enormous for both sides, and each government understands that victory would be far more complicated than many assume. For the United States, a war against Iran would differ dramatically from previous campaigns in the Middle East. Iran possesses a large population, difficult terrain, extensive military forces, naval assets in Persian Gulf, cyber capabilities, and a network of regional allies and proxies. Even if American forces achieved rapid military successes, the broader conflict could threaten supplies, disrupt global trade, destabilize allied governments, and potentially draw multiple regional actors into the fighting. The financial and political burden could become immense. Iran faces its own limitations. Although it has developed significant military capabilities, it remains economically vulnerable. Sanctions, infrastructure damage, reports and disruptions to oil exports and sustained air campaigns could impose severe costs. Iranian leaders understand that a direct Iranian leaders understand that a direct military confrontation with the world's most powerful military carries risks that could threaten both national security and domestic stability. This mutual recognition creates an unusual strategic environment. Both sides want to demonstrate strength. Both want to deter the other. Both want to protect their interests and maintain credibility. Yet neither side wants to trigger a chain of events that leads to uncomfortable regional war. As a result, military actions are often carefully calibrated. Strikes are conducted with limited objectives. Retaliation is measured. Political and public rhetoric may sound aggressive, but behind the scenes there are often efforts to preserve escalation and prevent them from spiraling beyond control. The consequence is a pattern of limited confrontation rather than decisive warfare. Each crisis becomes a contest of pressure dynamic rather than conquest. This dynamic explains why periods of intense fighting are frequently followed by negotiations, ceasefire, and temporary arrangements. The objective is not necessarily to defeat the opponent outright, but to gain leverage while avoiding catastrophe. That balance is fragile, and it is one of the main reasons the conflict repeatedly stops before reaching its most extreme form, the shadow war across the Middle East. One of the most unusual aspects of the US Iran confrontation is that much of it takes place indirectly. Rather than engaging each other in conventional battles, both sides often compete through proxies, partners, intelligence operations, cyber campaigns, and regional alliances. One of the most unusual aspects of the US Iran confrontation is that much of it takes place indirectly. Rather than engaging each other in conventional battles, both sides often compete through partners, proxies, intelligence operations, cyber campaigns, and regional alliances. This has created what many analysts describe as a shadow war, a conflict that rarely disappears but frequently changes form. Over the years, Iran has built relationships with armed groups and political movements across the Middle East. These networks provide Tehran with strategic depth and influence far beyond its borders. From Iran's perspective, these partnerships act as a defensive shield, extending deterrence and making any attack against the country almost impossible. From Washington's perspective, however, these same networks are often viewed as instruments of Iranian power projection and threaten regional stability and American allies. The United States has responded by strengthening partnerships with regional governments, expanding military deployments, and conducting intelligence operations, as well as supporting efforts to limit Iranian influence. This competition extends across multiple countries simultaneously. Events in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and the Persian Gulf often become interconnected parts of a broader strategic contest. What makes proxy conflicts particularly dangerous is that they can generate escalation without either Washington or Tehran initially intending it. A local clash can trigger retaliation. A retaliation can provoke further responses. Political leaders then face domestic pressure to appear strong, reducing their room for compromise. A relatively small incident can suddenly evolve into an international crisis. At the same time, proxy wars offer both sides a mechanism for managing risk. By operating indirectly, they can compete aggressively while maintaining a degree of separation from direct confrontation. This approach lowers the immediate probability of total war but increases the likelihood of recurring crises. The result is a conflict that rarely reaches a decisive conclusion. Instead, it shifts from one battlefield to another, from one missile attack to cyber operations to another, from diplomatic negotiations to covert actions. As long as this shadow war continues, any ceasefire between the United States and Iran is likely to remain fragile. Even if direct hostilities stop, tensions can reappear through regional actors whose actions influence the broader strategic balance. In this environment, peace becomes less a permanent condition and more a temporary pause between successive rounds of competition. The nuclear question, the core issue that never disappears. At the center of nearly every major US-Iran crisis lies one issue that consistently returns regardless of changes in leadership, diplomacy, or regional events: Iran's nuclear program. While proxy conflicts, missile strikes, and regional rivalries often dominate headlines, the nuclear question remains a strategic issue that shapes long-term calculations on both sides. Iran maintains that its nuclear activities are intended for peaceful purposes, such as energy production, scientific research, and technological development. Iranian leaders frequently argue that as a sovereign nation they possess the right to develop civilian nuclear capabilities. Many within Iran also view nuclear technology as a symbol of national independence and scientific achievement. particularly after decades of sanction and international pressure. The United States has, and several of its allies view the issue differently. Their primary concern is not merely the existence of nuclear facilities but the possibility that advanced enrichment capabilities could shorten the path towards a nuclear weapon. Even if Iran doesn't actively pursue a bomb, the ability to rapidly produce one could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Middle East. This disagreement has repeatedly produced cycles of negotiations and confrontation. Diplomatic agreements have attempted to limit enrichment levels, restrict stockpiles, and increase international monitoring. Yet every agreement faces a difficult challenge. Neither side fully trusts the other. Washington fears hidden nuclear advances, while Tehran fears that concessions may not lead to lasting sanctions relief or security guarantees. The nuclear issue is especially dangerous because it creates hard deadlines. Proxy conflicts can continue indefinitely. Economic sanctions can last for years. Nuclear development, however, is often measured in technical milestones and timelines. Whenever Iran advances its capabilities or international inspectors raise concerns, pressure builds for a response. Diplomatic urgency increases, military options are discussed, and regional tensions rise. This dynamic helps explain why periods of apparent calm can suddenly collapse. Even when fighting decreases and negotiations appear promising, the nuclear question remains unresolved beneath the surface. As long as both sides maintain fundamentally different objectives regarding Iran's nuclear future, the possibility of renewed confrontation will persist. The issue acts like a fault line running beneath the entire relationship, often hidden, sometimes quiet, but always capable of producing another major crisis. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's most dangerous choke point. Few places on Earth carry as much geopolitical significance as the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway, located between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, serves as one of the most important energy corridors in the world. A substantial portion of global traded oil and liquefied natural gas passes through these waters every day. Because of this, many crises involving the strait immediately becomes an international concern extending far beyond the Middle East. For Iran, the Strait of Hormuz represents both a vulnerability and a source of leverage. Iran cannot completely escape the economic importance of these waters because its own exports depend on access to the Gulf. Yet the country's geographic position also gives it the ability to threaten maritime traffic during periods of high tension. Over the years, Iranian military planning has focused heavily on creating deterrence within this confined maritime environment. Rather than relying on largely conventional fleets, Iran developed strategies designed specifically for the geography of the Gulf. Fast attack craft, anti-ship missiles, naval mines, drones, coastal defense systems, and surveillance networks are all intended to complicate the operations of more powerful naval forces. The objective is not necessarily to defeat a superior navy outright but to raise the risks and cost of intervention. For the United States, freedom of navigation through the strait has long been a strategic priority. American naval forces maintain a significant presence in the region, working alongside allies to secure shipping lanes and reassure energy markets. Any disruption to maritime traffic could affect oil prices and global inflation, supply chains, and economic stability across multiple continents. This creates another reason why the US Iran conflict tends to stop and start rather than escalate endlessly. Both sides understand that a major disruption in the strait could trigger severe economic consequences affecting not only themselves but also countries around the world. As tensions rise, markets react immediately. Government pressure all parties to avoid escalation. Diplomatic channels become more active, and efforts to restore stability intensify. The Strait of Hormuz therefore acts as both a flashpoint and a restraint. It is one of the most likely locations for future incidents, yet it is also one of the strongest incentives preventing uncontrolled escalation. Whenever conflict approaches a level that threatens global energy flows, international pressure for de-escalation increases dramatically. This contributes to the recurring pattern of confrontation followed by negotiations, making the strait one of the key mechanisms behind the stop-start nature of the broader US-Iran rivalry. Why ceasefire often fail? History shows that ending a conflict is often easier than securing a lasting peace. Ceasefire can halt active fighting, but they do not automatically eliminate the causes of war. In the case of the United States and Iran, this problem is especially severe because the two sides enter negotiations carrying decades of accumulated distrust, conflicting interests, and competing strategic objectives. A ceasefire is essentially a pause. It creates a space for diplomacy, reduces immediate risk, and allows leaders to reassess their options. However, if the underlying disputes remain unresolved, The pause can become temporary rather than permanent. Both sides may use the period to rebuild capabilities, strengthen alliances, and improve defenses, as well as prepare for future contingencies. In such situations, the absence of fighting doesn't necessarily mean the presence of peace. Trust represents one of the greatest obstacles. Successful peace agreements require both confidence and the other side will honor its commitments. In the US Iran relationship, that confidence has historically been limited. Each side views past events as evidence that another cannot be fully trusted. Political leadership therefore fast Political leadership therefore faced pressure from domestic audiences, military institutions, and regional partners to remain cautious and skeptical. Regional developments can also undermine ceasefires. An agreement between Washington and Tehran doesn't automatically control every actor operating across the Middle East. Local conflicts, proxy groups, intelligence operations, and third party interventions can generate new crises. A single missile attack, naval incident, assassination, or broader clash may be enough to reignite tensions and place diplomatic progress at risk. Domestic politics further complicate matters. Governments must balance international negotiations with internal political realities. Leaders who appear too conciliatory may face criticism from opponents. Hardline factions often argue that compromise signals weaknesses. While moderates argue that continued confrontation is unsustainable, this competing pressure can make long term agreements difficult to maintain even when both sides initially support them. As a result, ceasefires in the US Iran confrontation frequently resembles bridges suspended over deep strategic divide. They can reduce tensions and create opportunities for progress, but they remain vulnerable to shocks from multiple directions. Unless the deeper issue are addressed, every ceasefire carries within it the possibility of future escalation. This is why analysts often describe such agreements not as the end of a conflict but as the beginning of another uncertain phase in a much longer struggle. The most likely future, neither peace nor war. When people think about international conflicts, they often imagine two clear outcomes: either peace is achieved or war breaks out. The reality of the US Iran relationship is far more complex. The most probable future may be neither of these extremes. Instead, the relationship is likely to remain trapped in a state of strategic competition that periodically shifts between confrontation and restraint. A lasting peace would require major compromise from both sides. The United States would need confidence that Iran's nuclear activities, missile programs, and regional influences no longer threaten its interests or those of its allies. Iran would require guarantees regarding sanction relief, economic normalization, national sovereignty, and long term security. Achieving all of these objectives simultaneously would demand an extraordinary level of political will and mutual trust that has rarely existed between the two countries. A full scale war, meanwhile, remains a highly risky option. The military, economic, and geopolitical consequences would be severe. Regional instability could spread across multiple countries. Global energy markets could experience major disruptions. International powers would likely become involved diplomatically and economically. If one side achieved tactical victories, the broader strategic costs could outweigh the gains. This leaves a third possibility that increasingly appears to be the most realistic one. The United States and Iran continue competing across diplomatic, economic, military, and regional arenas without crossing the threshold into a prolonged direct war. Tensions periodically rise, incidents occur, limited strikes, and retaliations take place. Negotiations resume, temporary agreements are reached, then the cycle repeats. In this environment, periods of calm should not be mistaken for permanent stability, and episodes of violence should not be automatically be interpreted as the beginning of an all-out war. The relationship is likely to continue operating within a narrow space between these two outcomes. Strategic competition becomes the norm, while peace and war remains the outer boundaries that both sides seek to avoid for different reasons. For observers around the world, this means the headlines may continue to follow a familiar pattern. One month may bring diplomatic breakthroughs and optimistic statements. The next may feature military incidents and renewed threats. Understanding this cycle is essential because it reveals that the real story is not a single crisis or agreement. The real story is the persistence of a rivalry that has adapted, evolved, and survived for decades without ever reaching a definitive conclusion. The conflict that refuses to end. The question of whether the US Iran conflict will start again, and then stop once more ultimately reflects the unique nature of this rivalry. Unlike traditional wars that conclude with clear victories or defeats, this confrontation has become a long term political struggle shaped by competing interests, historical grievances, regional power balances, and strategic calculations. Throughout the decades, sanctions have been imposed and lifted, military strikes have been launched and answered, negotiations have begun, collapsed, and resumed. Governments have changed in both countries, yet the underlying rivalry has remained remarkably resilient. Every generation has witnessed new crises, but none has produced a permanent resolution. The fundamental challenge is that both sides possess strong incentives to resist the other's objectives while simultaneously avoiding the cost of an unrestricted war. This creates a strategic equilibrium that is unsustainable yet durable. Escalation occurs because neither side wishes to appear weak. De-escalation occurs because neither side wishes to bear consequences of total conflict. This result is a recurring cycle that continues for years and potentially decades. Recent ceasefire and diplomatic initiatives may reduce immediate tensions, and they can certainly create opportunities for meaningful purposes and progresses. Yet, history suggests caution. Temporary agreements often address the symptoms of the conflict, while leaving its deeper causes almost intact. Unless those deeper disputes are resolved, future crises will remain possible. Regardless of how promising current negotiations appear, in the end, the most realistic expectation is not the arrival of a final peace treaty or the outbreak of an inevitable, world changing war. It is the continuation of a geopolitical contest that periodically intensifies then recedes. The battlefield may change, the methods may evolve, the leaders may come and go, but the strategic competition itself is likely to endure, and that is the most important reason of all. The real danger is not a conflict that suddenly begins, it is a conflict that never truly ends, repeatedly pausing just long enough for the world to believe it has. Epilogue. What could finally break the cycle? Every long running geopolitical rivalry eventually reaches a turning point. Some end through decisive military victories, others conclude through economic exhaustion, political transformation, technological change, or diplomatic breakthroughs that were once thought impossible. The question facing analysts today is what event, if any, could break the cycle of confrontation between the United States and Iran. One possibility is a comprehensive diplomatic settlement, such as an agreement, would go far beyond a temporary ceasefire. It would address nuclear issues, sanctions, regional and security agreements, maritime navigation, economic relations, and mechanisms for crisis management. Yet the cycle and the scale of such an undertaking makes it extraordinarily difficult. Decades of mistrust cannot be erased by a single document. Another possibility is a fundamental shift within the region. The Middle East is constantly evolving. New economic partners emerge, governments change priorities, and technological developments alter military balances. Future leaders may view old disputes differently from their predecessors. Strategic interests that seem irreconcilable today may appear less important in different geopolitical environment. Economic realities could also play a role. History has deliberately shown that nations often adjust their policies when the cost of confrontation becomes unsustainable. If prolonged tensions significantly hinder economic growth, investment, energy exports, domestic development, and political pressure for compromise, this could increase on all sides. At the same time, there is a less optimistic possibility. The cycle may continue because it serves certain strategic purpose. Limited confrontation can strengthen deterrence, reinforces alliances, justify military preparedness, and maintain regional influence. If key actors continue to believe they gain more from competition than from compromise, the rivalry may persist indefinitely. For now, the evidence suggests that the United States and Iran remain locked within a pattern that neither side fully controls nor fully escapes. Ceasefires may hold for months or years, negotiations may produce meaningful progress, crises may fade from headlines, yet the underlying contest remains. The future, therefore, depends not only on military power or diplomatic skill, but on whether leaders on all sides eventually conclude that the rewards of ending the rivalry outweigh the advantages of managing it. Until then, calculations change. The cycle of stop, start, escalation, and restraint is likely to remain one of the defining features of the US-Iran relationship and one of the most consequential geopolitical stories of the 21st century. For more than 4 decades, the United States and Iran have been locked in one of the world's most complex geopolitical rivalries. Military strikes, economic sanctions, proxy wars, nuclear negotiations, and fragile ceasefires have created a cycle that seems to repeat itself again and again. In this video, we have examined why the US-Iran conflict repeatedly escalates and de-escalates, the historical roots of the rivalry, and the role of Iran's nuclear program, the strategic importance of the Strait of Hormuz, and the shadow war being fought across the Middle East. We also explored why neither side appears eager for a full-scale war, yet neither is willing for a full back down. Is a ceasefire a genuine path to peace or merely a pause before the next crisis? Could diplomacy finally break the cycle, or are the United States and Iran destined to remain trapped in a pattern of confrontation for decades to come? Thank you for joining us in this historical analysis and and understanding the future of one of the most consequential geopolitical rivalries of the modern era.